Abeni was a girl of simple dreams. She had grown up in a quiet village where the days were filled with the warmth of family and the familiar rhythm of daily life. She loved the sound of her mother's laughter, the scent of fresh earth after the rains, and the stories told by the elders under the shade of the great baobab tree. More than anything, she dreamed of a peaceful future, one where she would marry a kind man, have a small home of her own, and raise a few children with love and care. But fate had other plans. One evening, as she helped her mother prepare food, her father returned home with a serious expression. He called for her to sit before him, his voice carrying the weight of something important. The village elders had spoken. A marriage proposal had come. Not just any proposal, but one from the great chief himself. At first, Abeni thought she had misheard. The chief was a powerful man, known across many lands. He had wealth, influence, and a household so large it was said to be a village of its own. Why would a man like him choose her? Then came the truth that sent a chill through her body. The chief was not looking for his first wife. He already had 20 wives. He already had 100 children. And now she was to become part of that world. Her mother's face was unreadable, her father's voice calm but firm. This was not a choice. It was a decision made for her. To refuse would be an insult to the chief, a risk no family would take. Her mother took her hands, whispering reassurances, but Abeni could hear the sadness in her voice. Fear crept into her heart. She tried to imagine herself among so many wives, lost in a household of endless faces. Would she be forgotten? Would she even matter? That night, she lay awake, staring at the stars, her thoughts a tangled web of emotions. She had always believed marriage would be a new beginning, a step into happiness. Now, it felt like she was walking into the unknown, with no way to turn back. By morning, she had no choice but to accept her fate. The wedding was unlike anything Abeni had ever seen. It was grand, extravagant, and overwhelming. People from different villages arrived, bringing gifts and singing songs of praise for the chief. Dancers moved in perfect rhythm, their feet kicking up dust as drums echoed through the air. Women adorned in the finest fabrics ululated in celebration, and the scent of roasted meats filled the feast tables. Abeni, dressed in the most beautiful garments she had ever worn, felt like a stranger in her own wedding. She was paraded through the village, her face carefully painted, her hands decorated with intricate patterns. Every eye was on her, yet she felt invisible. This was not the intimate, joyful union she had once imagined. It was a display, a spectacle, a reminder that she now belonged to someone powerful. When the final rituals were completed, she was led to her new home. It was not just a house, it was an entire compound, larger than her entire village. Towering walls surrounded the estate, and inside there were countless huts and buildings, each housing different members of the chief's enormous family. As she stepped inside, she saw them, the other wives. Some stood together in small groups, watching her with unreadable expressions. A few offered polite nods, while others barely acknowledged her presence. Then there were the children. So many children, laughing, playing, running across the courtyard. Some stared at her curiously, others didn't seem to notice her at all. The air felt heavy with expectation. She was taken to her designated quarters, a small but comfortable space, far from the chief's main residence. A servant explained the rules of the household, when meals were served, how duties were divided, when the wives could see the chief. Abeni listened in silence, feeling the weight of each new reality settle upon her shoulders. She had entered a world where she was just one among many. There was no special place for her here, no assurance of love or attention. That night, as she lay in her unfamiliar bed, she felt a deep loneliness she had never known before. The voices outside blurred into a distant hum, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to cry. The first days in her new home were a blur of confusion and exhaustion. Abeni quickly realized that life in the chief's household was not just about being a wife, it was about survival. There were unspoken rules, hierarchies she didn't yet understand, and expectations placed upon her from the moment she arrived. The senior wives barely acknowledged her presence. Some were indifferent, treating her as if she were invisible. Others were openly cold, their gazes sharp with silent judgment. They had seen many young brides enter this household before. Some had adapted, others had faded into the background. Abeni was just another addition to their already crowded world. She tried to find her place, but the sheer scale of the household made it difficult. There were so many people, wives, children, servants, each with their own duties and roles. Every morning, the compound came alive with activity, meals being prepared in large pots over open fires, children rushing about, elders gathering to discuss matters of importance. The wives had their own routines, their own groups, and Abeni was left to figure out where she belonged. She struggled with names. The children, especially, were too many to keep track of. Some were polite, greeting her with curiosity, while others ignored her completely. A few seemed resentful, as if she had taken a place that once belonged to someone else. She could not blame them. She felt just as lost as they did. The responsibilities of the household were overwhelming. Every wife had a role, and though Abeni had not been assigned one yet, she was expected to contribute. Meals had to be prepared in vast quantities, clothing needed to be washed, the younger children had to be watched. The older wives managed these tasks with ease, but for Abeni, it felt like an impossible burden. And then there was the chief. In the days leading up to her marriage, she had imagined what kind of husband he would be. Would he be kind? Would he make her feel welcome? But the reality was far different. He was distant, barely acknowledging her presence. He had many wives, many children, and many duties. Abeni was just one of many. At night, she lay in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, feeling more alone than she ever had before. This was her life now. A life she had not chosen. A life she was expected to embrace. But deep inside, she wondered, was there a place for her in this vast, unfamiliar world? Abeni soon realized that being a wife in the chief's household was not just about being a partner to him. It also meant becoming a mother to the many children who lived under his roof. She had assumed that she would only need to care for her own future children, but she quickly learned that every wife was expected to help raise all the children, regardless of who their birth mother was. From dawn to dusk, the household revolved around the needs of the children. Meals had to be prepared in massive portions, with food carefully rationed to ensure everyone received their share. Abeni watched as senior wives oversaw the cooking, their practiced hands moving efficiently as they divided portions among the many small hands that eagerly reached for them. She was given tasks, sometimes helping with the younger children's meals, other times ensuring they were washed and clothed properly. Caring for sick children was another duty she had to learn. When illness spread through the household, it was the wife's responsibility to provide herbal treatments and comfort to the sick. Abeni watched and learned, memorizing which remedies worked best for fevers, stomach pains, and wounds from children's endless games. But it was difficult to care for children, who saw her as nothing more than another wife among many. The older ones were the most difficult. They were already used to the structure of the household, and to them, Abeni was just another woman who had come to take a place among their many mothers. Some ignored her completely, refusing to listen to her instructions. Others openly defied her, questioning her authority. When she tried to help a young boy tie his sandals, he pulled away and muttered, "I don't need your help. I have a mother." It hurt more than she expected. At night, exhaustion settled deep in her bones. The household was full of life, full of people, but Abeni had never felt more alone. She longed for the warmth of her own mother, for the comfort of the home she had left behind. Here, she was surrounded by people, yet no one truly saw her. But if she was to survive in this house, she knew she had to find a way to belong. Even if the children rejected her now, even if the wives dismissed her, she refused to remain invisible forever. At first, the children treated Abeni as just another unfamiliar face in their already large world. She was another wife, another pair of hands tending to them, another voice calling them to eat, wash, or behave. But Abeni knew that if she was ever going to find her place in this household, it would have to be through them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the air cooled, she sat under a large tree near the courtyard. A few children played nearby, laughing and chasing each other, while others sat idly, drawing patterns in the dirt. Abeni took a deep breath and began to tell a story. At first, no one paid attention. But as she spoke, her voice carrying the rhythm of the tale, one child stopped and turned, then another. Soon, a small group gathered around her, listening with wide eyes as she spun a tale of clever animals, fearless warriors, and enchanted rivers. When she finished, the children begged for another, and she obliged. That night, something changed. Over the next few days, she continued telling stories, weaving magic into the evenings. She sang songs her mother had once sung to her, clapping her hands to the beat, inviting the little ones to join in. She played simple games, teaching them how to count with pebbles and how to create patterns in the sand. The younger children, drawn to her warmth, began to follow her, seeking her attention and laughter. Among them, she noticed one boy who always sat alone. He was smaller than the others, his clothes slightly worn, his gaze distant. Through whispered conversations with a servant, Abeni learned that he had no mother. One of the wives had died years ago, and though the household provided for him, no one truly claimed him as their own. Abeni made a quiet decision. She started sitting beside him during meals, gently encouraging him to eat more. She helped him with his clothes, combed his hair, and spoke to him with kindness. At first, he resisted, but over time, he began to sit closer, to listen when she spoke. And finally, one night, he reached for her hand as they walked back to the sleeping quarters. The other children saw this, and, one by one, they opened their hearts to her. But not everyone was pleased. The senior wives began to take notice. They whispered among themselves, their eyes watching her every move. They had spent years maintaining control over the household, each one ensuring that their own children were favored. Abeni, with her quiet ways and growing influence among the children, was becoming a threat. And in a house of many, threats were never left unchallenged. Whispers followed Abeni wherever she went. The senior wives, once indifferent to her presence, now watched her with wary eyes. They gathered in quiet corners, speaking in hushed tones, their words carrying suspicion and resentment. "She thinks she is different from the rest of us," one murmured. "The children follow her like she is their only mother," another added. It did not take long before the whispers turned into accusations. If a meal was delayed, it was Abeni's fault. If a child misbehaved, it was because she spoiled them. If a wife was in a bad mood, somehow, Abeni was to blame. The household had always had its tensions, but now she had become the easy target. At first, she tried to ignore it, but the weight of their resentment grew heavier with each passing day. One morning, as she carried a basket of fruit to the children, an older wife blocked her path. "You act like their mother, but you are not," the woman said sharply. "Do not forget your place." Abeni met her gaze but said nothing. There was no point in arguing. She had two choices: fight back and risk making enemies, or remain silent and continue doing what she knew was right. She chose the latter. Instead of defending herself with words, she let her actions speak. She continued tending to the children, soothing their fears, teaching them through stories, and treating them with patience. She made no demands, took no sides, and never spoke against the other wives. When they criticized her, she responded with silence. When they pushed her aside, she stepped back without complaint. But the children saw everything. They noticed how she never raised her voice, how she never spoke cruelly, how she was always there when they needed comfort. Slowly, even the older children, those who had once dismissed her, began to acknowledge her. One evening, when a small girl tripped and scraped her knee, Abeni was the first to reach her. She gently wiped the wound, humming softly as she worked. The child sniffled, her tears slowing, and then she did something that surprised everyone. She reached up and hugged Abeni tightly. The senior wives watched, their expressions unreadable. Some remained resentful, others indifferent. But a few of them, perhaps for the first time, saw her not as a rival, but as something else entirely. Abeni did not need to fight for power. She was earning something far greater: respect. Trouble arrived in the form of empty food stores and worried whispers. The season had been harsh, rains had not come when expected, and the harvest had been poor. The chief's vast household, usually full of noise and activity, grew quieter as meals became smaller and stomachs remained half full. At first, the senior wives managed as they always had, ensuring their own children had enough to eat. But as supplies dwindled, tensions rose. Arguments broke out in the kitchens, children cried from hunger, and the once organized household threatened to fall into chaos. Abeni saw it all: the desperation, the fear, the selfishness. She could not stand by and do nothing. While others hoarded what little they had, Abeni stepped forward. She went to the storage rooms, counted every grain of millet, every dried fruit, every last root vegetable. She called on the servants, the younger wives, and even some of the older children to help. Together, they portioned out what was left, ensuring that every child, no matter who their mother was, received food. Some of the wives scoffed at her efforts. "You are wasting your time. Worry about your own survival," one of them sneered. But Abeni refused to listen. She worked tirelessly, waking before dawn and staying up late into the night. She organized meals, making sure no child went to sleep hungry. She found creative ways to stretch the food, mixing grains with herbs to make filling porridge, teaching the children which wild fruits were safe to eat. Even the angriest children, the ones who had once ignored her, began to look at her differently. When she placed food in their hands, they did not turn away. When she spoke, they listened. One night, as she sat by the fire, exhausted but unwilling to rest, a small boy approached her. He had once been among those who resisted her kindness. Without a word, he crawled into her lap, resting his head against her shoulder. "Thank you, mother," he whispered. Tears stung Abeni's eyes, but she did not let them fall. The famine would pass, the food would return, and life would go on. But something had changed forever. She was no longer just another wife. She had become a mother, not by blood, but by love. The chief had always ruled his household with firm authority, yet he spent little time concerning himself with its daily workings. His wives managed the affairs, and the children grew up under the care of their mothers. But something had changed. Where once there had been constant disputes, the household was now quieter, more orderly. The children, who had once fought over food, attention, and favoritism, now shared meals without quarrel. The younger ones no longer cried from hunger or neglect, and even the older children, who had been unruly and distant, had softened. The chief took notice. One evening, as he walked through the courtyard, he watched as his children sat around Abeni, listening to one of her stories. Even the most stubborn among them sat close, their faces alight with admiration. He had never seen them this way before, united, content, at peace. Curious, he spoke to some of the older wives. "What has changed?" he asked. Some responded with bitter words. "She acts as though she is their only mother," one wife muttered. "She has turned the children against us," another added. But others had grown to accept the truth. "She did what none of us could," one of the more reasonable wives admitted. "She brought them together." The chief could not ignore the truth before him. At the next household gathering, he made his decision known. Standing before his wives and children, He spoke with authority. From this day forward, Abeni will be the caretaker of all my children. She will ensure their well-being, their education, and their discipline. She has earned my trust, and she has earned theirs. A stunned silence followed. Some wives looked away, anger flashing in their eyes. Others nodded solemnly, accepting what they had already known in their hearts. The children, however, broke into smiles. They gathered around Abeni, their hands reaching for hers, their voices calling her name. Abeni had not sought power. She had not fought for status, but she had won something far more valuable: trust, respect, and a place that no one could take from her. She was no longer just a young girl lost in a world too big for her. She was now the mother of them all. At the time of her marriage, Abeni had not expected love. She had been chosen, like so many before her, and placed into a life where she was just one among many. The chief, a man of great power and many responsibilities, had hardly noticed her beyond the initial wedding ceremonies. For months, she had only seen him in brief moments, when he visited the household to see his children, when he addressed his wives with formal words, when he fulfilled his duties as a husband in a distant and impersonal way. But something was changing. It started with his gaze lingering on her longer than before. He watched as she guided the children with patience, as she calmed disputes among them, as she handled problems with quiet wisdom. Unlike some of his other wives, who schemed for influence or fought for his attention, Abeni never sought his favor. Yet, she had become the most trusted figure in his household. One evening, as she sat under the acacia tree, sewing torn garments for the children, she sensed his presence before she saw him. "You work harder than anyone here," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She glanced up, surprised. It was rare for him to speak to any wife alone, especially without purpose. "It must be done," she replied simply. For the first time, he sat beside her. Over the coming weeks, their interactions became more frequent. He asked her about the children, about the household, about how she managed to bring peace where others had failed. She answered honestly, never trying to impress him, only speaking the truth as she saw it. She too began to notice things about him, things she had ignored before. He was not just a distant ruler, but a man who carried the weight of a large family and a kingdom on his shoulders. His decisions were not always cold, but calculated, shaped by years of duty and expectation. One night, as they walked together through the quiet courtyard, he paused. "When I chose you, I did not know what you would become," he admitted. "You are unlike the others." Abeni did not respond right away. She had spent so long feeling trapped in this life, resisting it, enduring it. But now, standing beside him, feeling the weight of his words, she realized something had shifted. She no longer felt like a prisoner in this household. She was here by fate, but she had found purpose. She had found love, not in the way she had once dreamed, but in a way that had grown through respect, through time, through shared responsibility. And for the first time since her wedding day, she felt at peace with the life she had chosen to embrace. The peace Abeni had worked so hard to build was threatened when trouble came to the chief's lands. Whispers of rebellion spread from distant villages, and soon messengers arrived with urgent news. Rival clans were challenging the chief's rule. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the chief gathered his warriors. The household stood in silence, watching as he prepared to leave. His presence had always been a source of order, a reminder that his authority was absolute. But now, he would be gone, and the vast household would be left without its leader. Before mounting his horse, the chief turned to Abeni. "Until I return, you will ensure the household remains strong," he said. His voice carried both command and trust. Murmurs spread among the wives. Some of the senior ones exchanged doubtful glances. "She is young," one of them whispered. "She does not have the experience to lead us." "Why should she have authority over us all?" another muttered. Abeni heard their words, but did not let them shake her resolve. She had not asked for leadership, but the responsibility had been placed upon her shoulders, and she would not fail. Days passed, and tension grew within the household. The absence of the chief made some uneasy. Servants hesitated, unsure whom to follow. Wives argued over household matters. The children sensed the unrest and became restless. Abeni knew that without unity, everything would crumble. She gathered the wives and spoke with quiet strength. "We cannot afford division. This household must stand together, or we will fall apart." Some wives listened, while others still doubted her. But when trouble finally struck, it was Abeni who led them through it. A group of raiders, emboldened by the chief's absence, tried to steal livestock from the outer lands. Panic spread among the servants. The senior wives froze, unsure of what to do, but Abeni acted. She sent word to the remaining warriors in the household, instructing them to guard the vulnerable areas. She organized the younger wives and older children to secure food supplies. She stood firm, giving orders with the calm authority of someone who had always belonged in this role. By the time the raiders were driven away, the household remained untouched. No lives were lost. The livestock was safe, and the doubts surrounding Abeni began to fade. When the chief returned, he found his household exactly as he had left it, strong, disciplined, and intact. He looked at Abeni, and for the first time, there was no question of her place. She was not just his wife, she was his partner, his equal in responsibility. The woman who had not only earned his trust, but the trust of an entire household. And from that day on, no one ever questioned her leadership again. Abeni had once struggled to remember all their names, but now she knew each child as if they were her own. She knew who was afraid of the dark, who loved to sing, who struggled with their lessons, but excelled in storytelling. She knew which child needed a firm hand and which needed a gentle touch. At first, the younger ones had clung to her, their small hands always reaching for hers, their faces lighting up when she called them by name. But it was the older ones, the ones who had once ignored her or looked at her with suspicion, who truly showed how much had changed. One evening, a teenage boy, one of the chief's eldest sons, approached her as she sat weaving mats. He had barely spoken to her before, preferring the company of his own mother and the elders of the clan. But tonight, he hesitated, then sat beside her. "I have been asked to begin training as a warrior," he said after a long silence. She nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I am not sure if I am ready," he admitted. It was a moment of vulnerability, something he would never have shown in front of the chief or the other men. But here, with Abeni, he did not fear being seen as weak. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Strength is not just about holding a spear. It is about knowing when to fight and when to lead. You will learn, just as all great warriors have." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he did not see just another wife of his father. He saw his mother. Over time, more children sought her guidance. The daughters came to her for advice on their future marriages, the sons for wisdom before their rites of passage. She helped them through fears, through failures, through the trials of growing up in a household so vast that many had once felt forgotten. Her influence spread beyond the household walls. The village women began to seek her counsel, and even elders who had once dismissed her as just a young bride now spoke of her with respect. Abeni never bore a child of her own, but she had more children than she could have ever imagined. One day, as she walked through the courtyard, a small girl ran up to her, wrapping her arms around her waist. "Mama," she whispered, her voice full of love. It was in that moment Abeni truly understood. Motherhood was not about giving birth. It was about patience, about kindness, about standing firm, even when the world doubted you. It was about love. Deep, unwavering, unconditional love. And in that, she had become a mother greater than she had ever dreamed to be. There was a time when Abeni had felt like a stranger in the chief's household, an outsider navigating an unfamiliar world. But now, as she walked through the courtyard, she no longer felt out of place. The children ran to her with open arms, the servants bowed their heads in respect, and even the senior wives, some grudgingly, some sincerely, acknowledged her role. She had not fought for power. She had not demanded recognition. Yet, through patience, wisdom, and unwavering love, she had become the heart of the household. Even the chief himself sought her counsel now. Once a distant figure, he had come to depend on her insight, her ability to bring order where there had once been chaos. When important matters arose, disputes among the wives, decisions about the children, matters of the village, he turned to her. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, he spoke words she had never expected to hear. "You were brought here as my wife," he said, watching her carefully. "But you have become more than that. You have given this household something even I could not." She looked at him, surprised by the weight of his words. "And what is that?" she asked softly. "Unity," he answered. "You have given them a mother when they had none." For the first time since she had entered this life, she truly felt at peace. She had once dreamed of a small, quiet home, a husband who belonged only to her, a handful of children she could call her own. That dream had long since faded, replaced by something far greater than she had ever imagined. She had become a mother, not just to one child, but to an entire household. Her name began to carry weight beyond the walls of the chief's home. The women of the village spoke of her with admiration. The elders recognized her wisdom. Young wives who once feared being lost in the shadows of a powerful man's home looked to her as a guide. And in time, her story became more than just a tale of a girl who had been married to a man with 100 children. It became a legend of a woman who had found strength where there was none, who had turned duty into purpose, and who had, through love and sacrifice, become a mother to all. There was a time when Abeni had stood at the entrance of this vast household, her heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. She had been a girl torn from the simplicity of her village, thrust into a world where she was meant to be invisible, a mere addition to a man's many wives. But now, as she sat beneath the great baobab tree, children gathered around her feet, she could hardly recognize the girl she had once been. The once overwhelming household had become her home. The countless faces that had once blurred together were now as familiar to her as her own reflection. The same children who had once tested her, defied her, or ignored her, now sought her wisdom, her warmth, and her guidance. Even the chief, who had once been a distant figure in her life, now saw her as his most trusted advisor. He had many wives, but only one had earned his deepest respect. And while love had never been part of their union at first, it had grown between them in the quiet moments, in shared glances, in mutual understanding. As the years passed, Abeni's story became one whispered from mother to daughter, from elder to child. Young women who feared the unknown looked to her for strength. Mothers who felt powerless in their homes found inspiration in her journey. One day, a young bride, no older than Abeni had been when she first arrived, approached her with tear-filled eyes. "What if I do not belong here?" the girl asked. "What if I am never enough?" Abeni smiled, taking the girl's hands in hers. She saw in her the same fear she had once carried, the same uncertainty. "You will find your place," she said gently. "Not because it is given to you, but because you will carve it out yourself, not through force, but through love. And in time, you will see. You are more than enough." The girl wiped her tears, nodding as if those words were the only reassurance she had needed. As Abeni watched her walk away, she knew the cycle would continue. New wives would come, children would grow, and the household would always evolve. But her legacy would remain, not in the power she had gained, nor in the position she had earned, but in the love she had given. Motherhood was never just about birth. It was about patience in the face of struggle, strength in the face of doubt, love in the face of hardship. And through it all, Abeni had not just become a mother to many. She had become something far greater than she had ever imagined. She had become a woman who changed the lives of all who knew her. She had become more.